Right at the very moment our son was supposed to blow out the candles for his 18th birthday, my wife slid the divorce papers right across our polished mahogany table. Sitting there with this cold, calculating smile, she whispered that her timing couldn't have been more perfect. She thought she had me backed into a corner, positioned to strip away 60% of the tech empire I built from scratch. She honestly believed I was just some frail, decaying old man who'd lost his mind. But when our final court date came around, it wasn't my high-priced attorneys who tore her whole case to shreds. It was our usually quiet, teenage son. He stood in the middle of that courtroom, looked his mother straight in the eyes, and hit play on a digital recording device he'd kept hidden for 3 solid years. She turned ghost white and actually tried to sprint for the heavy oak doors, but the bailiffs grabbed her on the spot. Everything that came after was nothing short of poetic justice. My name is Richard Harrison. I'm 70 years old, and I live in Seattle, Washington. Over the last 40 years, I poured my blood, sweat, and endless stress into building a logistics software company, taking it from a tiny rented desk to a multi-million-dollar tech powerhouse. I didn't inherit a single dime. Everything I built was created with my own 2 hands, trading away my youth and my peace of mind just to make sure my family would never have to know the bitter taste of poverty. My wife, Valerie, is 52. She's 18 years younger than me. When we got married 20 years ago, I thought I'd found a brilliant, perceptive partner who truly understood my drive and ambition. Together, we had a son named Tyler. Tyler was a quiet boy, deeply introverted, but an absolute prodigy when it came to computers and complex technology. He rarely shared what was on his mind, always preferring the glowing blue light of his laptop screen over our chaotic family dinners. Or at least, that was the story I'd always told myself. Now, if you're tuning into this story, please hit the like button. Just knowing there are people out there listening to the truth brings a little light to an old man's heart, and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Connecting with all of you means the world to me before I dive into the nightmare that unfolded right inside my own home. It was a Tuesday evening, and Seattle was under its usual heavy downpour. Rain was slamming against the high glass windows of our formal dining room, smearing the city lights into blurry streaks of gold and red. It was a fitting backdrop for the exact moment my world came crashing down. That night was Tyler's 18th birthday. I came home early from the corporate offices, completely exhausted, but genuinely thrilled that my son was officially stepping into adulthood. I walked through the front door expecting the rich aroma of a roast coming from the oven. I expected a beautifully decorated cake with candles lighting up the room. Instead, our $5 million estate was dead silent. The kitchen was spotless. No pots on the stove, no scent of vanilla or sugar in the air anywhere. Valerie was sitting at the far end of the long table, dressed in a perfectly tailored black designer dress, slowly sipping a glass of wildly expensive red wine. Tyler was sitting directly across from her, his posture unnaturally stiff, staring blankly at an empty ceramic plate. I walked into the room, took off my wet coat, and stood there utterly baffled by the icy atmosphere. I asked where the food was. I asked where the birthday cake was. Valerie didn't answer right away. She took another slow, deliberate sip of her wine, locking eyes with me over the rim of her glass. Then, she reached down beside her chair, picked up a heavy manila envelope, and placed it on the table. She slid it down the polished wood until it stopped right in front of my usual seat. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at her, asking what was going on. She looked at me, and I will never forget the spine-chilling, completely hollow smile that spread across her face. That wasn't the smile of the woman I'd slept beside for 20 years. That was the smile of a predator that had finally trapped its exhausted prey. "Tyler turns 18 today," she said, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "He's officially an adult in the eyes of the law. I don't have to deal with you in a drawn-out, messy custody battle anymore. I don't have to deal with child support monitors, state guidelines, or co-parenting schedules. My timing is absolute perfection. Go ahead, Richard. Open it." My hand felt unnaturally heavy as I reached out for that envelope. I pulled out a stack of crisp white legal documents, divorce papers. But as I flipped through the heavy pages, I realized this was way more than a simple petition to split up. The demands printed on those pages took my breath away instantly. She wasn't asking for a clean, fair break. She was demanding 60% of the software empire I'd spent 40 years building. She wanted sole, absolute ownership of our Seattle estate, on top of demanding $30,000 a month in permanent spousal support for the rest of her life. This wasn't a settlement offer. This was an execution order for my entire life's work. I stared at those documents, my vision blurring from sheer shock. I asked her why she was doing this. I asked her how on earth she felt entitled to 60% of a tech firm she had never worked a single day at. Valerie threw her head back and laughed. It was a sharp, mocking sound that bounced off the high ceiling, sounding horrifyingly cruel. "You're 70 years old, Richard," she said coldly. "Over the last 3 years, you've been falling apart right in front of my eyes. You're a decaying, broken old man. I spent my best years taking care of you, nursing your fading mind, watching you forget the simplest things around the house. I earned every single dime of that company, and I am taking my share before you completely destroy it with your incompetence." I tore my eyes away from her, my heart hammering painfully against my ribs. I looked at my son. I expected to see a terrified, heartbroken kid. I expected to see a teenager crushed because his family was collapsing on his birthday. But when my eyes met Tyler's, the blood in my veins turned straight to ice. Tyler wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He was clutching his phone on that mahogany table so tightly, his knuckles were bone white, but his face was an unreadable mask. It was a cold, calculating, furious mask. He didn't look to me for comfort. He just kept his eyes glued to his mother. "Do you really think you've won?" Tyler whispered. His voice was impossibly steady, far too steady for a boy who had just watched his family get ripped apart. Valerie rolled her eyes and waved her manicured hand, brushing him off entirely. "Oh, grow up, Tyler. When you're older, you'll understand how the real world works." She turned her attention right back to me, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, threatening slits. "I'm not playing games, Richard," she warned, leaning across the table. "If you try to fight this in court, if you try to stall to protect your precious company, I will utterly ruin you. For 3 years, I've been meticulously documenting your erratic behavior. I will hand your medical records to a judge to prove you're completely unfit to handle your own finances. I will bring in private doctors to testify about your severe memory lapses, your constant confusion, and your brain fog. I'll have you declared legally incompetent and take full control long before this trial ends. Don't test me." I stood there in the deafening silence of that massive, empty dining room, holding those divorce papers, my hands trembling. She was right about one thing. Over the last 3 years, I had been struggling immensely. I'd been experiencing terrifying, thick brain fog. I suffered from sudden bouts of exhaustion and severe memory lapses that scared me to my core in private. I honestly thought it was just the brutal, unyielding reality of getting old. I thought my brain was finally giving out after decades of non-stop corporate stress. But standing there, watching the cruel, triumphant smirk on my wife's face, and noticing the deep, knowing spark in my 18-year-old son's eyes, a sickening realization began to crawl through my chest. Valerie hadn't just been waiting for Tyler to turn 18 to skip out on custody laws. She had been actively setting a trap. She'd been building a medical file against me, carefully orchestrating every single moment of my weakness. A wave of stomach-churning terror took over. If she was willing to throw divorce papers on her own son's birthday just to bypass custody laws, what else had she been doing behind my back? I had spent my entire life outsmarting business rivals, crushing hostile takeovers, and protecting my enterprise from ruthless competitors. Yet, I had left my own front door wide open. I had let my most dangerous enemy sleep right beside me. Looking at those predatory legal papers, I knew this wasn't just a divorce anymore. This was a fight for my survival, my legacy, and my sanity. The heavy silence in the dining room finally broke as I pushed my chair back, the wood scraping harshly against the marble floor. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't yell. I just grabbed that thick envelope, turned my back on the lavish birthday dinner that had turned into the funeral of my marriage, and walked straight into my home office. I knew she'd follow. Valerie could never resist an opportunity to twist sin at the knife and watch me bleed. Sure enough, just seconds later, the sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels echoed down the hallway. She stepped into the office, shutting the heavy mahogany door behind her with a soft, decisive thud. I sat behind my desk and looked at her. the very desk that had seen countless late nights spent building the wealth she now felt entitled to claim. I asked her a very simple, direct question. Why now? Why, after 20 years of marriage and raising a son together, was she dumping a financial death sentence on my plate? I wanted to know how she could look at the man she built a life with and try to strip away 60% of everything he built from scratch. Valerie didn't look ashamed at all. She didn't look guilty or conflicted. Instead, she put on an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. She let out a long, heavy sigh, her shoulders slumping as if she were carrying the weight of the entire world. She walked over to the leather armchair across from my desk, sank into it, and pressed her manicured fingertips to her temples, putting on a perfect show of fake exhaustion. She looked at me with fake, condescending pity. She claimed I was living in complete denial. She insisted that for the past 3 years, she had been nothing more than a high-end caregiver trapped in a beautiful prison. "You're 70 years old, Richard," she murmured, her voice laced with fake sympathy and barely hidden disgust. "You refuse to face what's happening to your own mind. You've been suffering from terrible brain fog. You forget where you put your keys. You forget important business conversations we had just hours before. You're going through a rapid, undeniable phase of early onset dementia, and it's completely draining me." She went on to detail how she had sacrificed her best years, her youth, to nurse a sick old man whose mind was slowly evaporating into nothingness. She painted herself as a tragic, devoted wife who simply couldn't handle the crushing burden of watching her husband lose his grip on reality anymore. She said she was desperately seeking cash compensation. She declared with absolute conviction she'd assured Hearn that she had earned every single share of my company as fair payment for losing those years, caring for a man who couldn't even keep track of his daily schedule. It was a perfectly constructed, vicious lie, specifically crafted to make me feel weak, burdensome, and entirely dependent on her goodwill. As she spoke, a terrifying chill ran down my skin, because the most dangerous lies in the world are the ones wrapped in a thin, convincing layer of truth. I sat there, gripping the edge of my solid desk, while fragmented memories from the past 36 months flashed through my head. I couldn't deny that I had felt deeply off. There were countless mornings I woke up, feeling as though my brain were submerged in thick, heavy water. During critical board meetings, I experienced sudden, unexplainable hand tremors, and there were profound, overwhelming moments of lethargy that I desperately tried to hide from my executives and clients, blaming it all on the inevitable decline of an aging body. I blamed it on 60-hour work weeks. I blamed it on the relentless pressure of running a massive logistic, software empire in a brutal market. But my mind snapped back to one very specific, consistent routine that had started 3 years ago. Without fail, Valerie was always the one who brought me my nightly chamomile tea. She was always the one who carefully sorted my blood pressure medication into those little plastic compartments. Every single night, she would stand by the bed, watching me with calm, unblinking eyes until I swallowed the pills and finished every last drop from the cup. She always told me it was because she loved me. She said she wanted to make sure my heart was protected and my health was maintained. Now, listening to her justify stealing my life's work based on a medical condition she was miraculously prepared to document legally, my pragmatic mind started piecing together a much darker puzzle. Those symptoms only started showing up after she took full control of my nightly medication. The brain fog only worsened on the nights I drank the specific tea she prepared for me. I didn't let her see the gears turning in my head. I just nodded, told her I was too tired to argue, and asked her to leave my office. The second the door clicked shut, I grabbed my coat, walked out into the rain, and drove straight to a secure private hotel downtown. I needed distance, and I needed legal counsel immediately. The very next morning, I was sitting in the sterile, soundproof conference room of my longtime attorney, Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was a cold, brilliant man, a legal veteran who had seen every dirty divorce trick in the corporate playbook. He flipped through the papers Valerie had handed me, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. He finally threw the heavy stack onto the polished glass table and looked at me with sharp, suspicious eyes. "Richard, something about this doesn't add up at all," he said, tapping his silver pen against the listed demands. "Valerie isn't just asking for 60% of your assets in cash equivalent. She is specifically demanding voting shares in your software firm. Jonathan explained that a spouse in her position, one who claimed to be exhausted and just wanted a clean break from a heavy marriage, almost always demanded a massive cash buyout so they could take the money and run to live a new life. They never wanted to be tied down to managing corporate equity, especially in a highly technical logistics firm they had zero background in. Yet Valerie was desperate for those actual shares. She wanted voting rights. She wanted a permanent seat on the executive board. Why? Why would a supposedly exhausted, traumatized wife want to embed herself deep within the board of a company she knew nothing about, technically? Jonathan leaned forward, his voice dropping into a grave whisper. "She doesn't just want your money, Richard," he said, looking me dead in the eye. "She wants to force a complete takeover of your entire corporate structure. And to pull off a takeover of this scale, she desperately needs you declared legally incompetent." The chilling weight of Jonathan's words hung heavily on my shoulders as I left his office and stepped back out into the Seattle rain. If Valerie was planning to strip my shares and seize control of my company, she needed a financial foothold inside the organization. She needed someone deeply embedded in daily operations to help execute the takeover. My mind locked onto one specific person right away. 5 years ago, when my previous CFO retired, Valerie aggressively recommended his replacement. She practically forced a resume into my hands, singing the praises of a 45-year-old financial executive named Derek Lawson. She claimed he was a brilliant talent who could modernize our revenue streams. I trusted her judgment, and I hired him. Now I needed to look that man straight in the eyes. I drove straight back to corporate headquarters, bypassed my executive suite, and walked down the hall to the finance department. I didn't knock. I just pushed open the heavy glass door to Derek's office and walked right in. Derek was sitting behind his wide, modern desk, typing rapidly on his dual monitors. He looked up, clearly startled by my sudden appearance, and quickly minimized a window on his screen. A panicked move that didn't escape my notice. I sat in the chair across from him, keeping my expression completely neutral, and dropped the latest quarterly financial summary between us. I demanded to know why our net profit margins had been dropping for the past 3 years. During that exact time frame, we had landed 3 massive contracts. Our gross revenue was at an all-time high, yet bottom-line profits were leaking out month after month. The math simply didn't line up with our actual sales. Derek didn't flinch. He leaned back in his leather chair, laced his fingers together, and gave me a polished, rehearsed smile. He launched into a complex, jargon-heavy monologue, talking in circles about how unexpected inflation was eating away at operational margins. He blamed major structural changes in corporate tax laws, claiming they required massive capital reserves. He rambled on about aggressive server upgrades that he insisted were crucial to keeping our software infrastructure secure. It was a carefully constructed financial smokescreen designed to overwhelm whoever was listening. He spoke to me slowly, the way someone speaks to a confused, aging patient. I sat there gripping the armrests of my chair, feeling a burning rage build in my chest. I knew my industry. I knew the operational costs of my own software. His explanations sounded technically plausible on the surface, but mathematically, they were utterly absurd for our actual scale. I leaned forward, ready to tear his fabricated financial reports to pieces. But before I could say a single word, the glass door opened, and Valerie walked in. Wearing a beige trench coat, she looked completely out of place in corporate finance. My heart skipped a beat. What was she doing here? I had left her at home just hours ago. She walked right past me, placed a gentle, protective hand on Derek's shoulder, and looked down at me with an exaggerated expression of maternal concern. "Richard, what are you doing down here bothering Derek?" she asked, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "You know your doctor said you need to avoid high-stress environments." I stared at her, utterly baffled by her sudden intrusion, and told her I was conducting a basic financial audit of my own company. Valerie sighed and looked at Derek with an apologetic smile. "Derek, please forgive him," she murmured, acting as if I weren't even in the room. "His cognitive decline has been so terrible lately. He gets these paranoid episodes and forgets investments we've already discussed at home. Please don't let him stress you out or disrupt your workflow. I'll take him home so he can rest." The sheer audacity of her act left me momentarily speechless. She was openly treating me like a child, in front of my own executive, actively reinforcing the narrative of my cognitive decline right inside the office to build her guardianship case. But as she stood there, effectively shielding Derek from my questioning, my eyes drifted down to Derek's left wrist, resting casually on the edge of the desk. Peeking out from beneath the crisp white cuff of his custom shirt was a watch. It wasn't just any watch. It was a brand new, solid gold Rolex, a piece I knew the exact price of because I had once considered buying it as a retirement gift to myself. That was a $40,000 watch. A heavy feeling settled deep in my stomach. My gut, the instinct that had kept me alive in the business world for 40 years, started screaming. A chief financial officer claiming the company was barely scraping by wouldn't casually buy a $40,000 watch on a random Tuesday. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifying, but they were finally coming together. Valerie wasn't just trying to steal the company through a divorce. She and Derek were actively draining it from the inside out. I realized that if I stayed in that office and confronted them without undeniable proof, they would use my anger as evidence of mental instability. They would call security. They would call an ambulance. They would win. So, I slowly stood up, nodding along like a tired, confused old man accepting defeat. I apologized to Derek for interrupting his day, told Valerie she was right about my headache, and said I needed to lie down. I walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove away, but I didn't go back to the estate. I couldn't bring myself to sleep under the same roof as the woman actively plotting my total destruction. I drove to a luxury hotel downtown, checked in using my personal account, and bought myself a few days of isolated silence. I needed to clear my head. I needed a strategy to unravel their operation before they realized I was on to them. Sitting in the dim light of that hotel room, staring out at the Seattle skyline while rain beat relentlessly against the glass, the absolute silence felt heavy, deeply isolating, and suffocating. I felt utterly alone, betrayed by the woman I had trusted with my life. Then, just before midnight, a quiet, hesitant knock echoed through the room. I walked over and opened the door. Tyler was standing in the hallway, looking completely exhausted. His clothes were soaked through from the freezing rain, his shoulders slumped, and dark circles under his eyes made him look fragile. He didn't say a word to me at first. He walked slowly into the quiet room, reached into his pocket, and held out his hand. Lying in his palm was a small plastic bottle of effervescent vitamin tablets. I stared at the plastic cylinder, completely unable to understand what my son was showing me. The room was dead silent, save for the rain pounding against the large window. Tyler walked to the center of the room, looking like he hadn't slept in days, carrying a fatigue that aged his young face. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently placed the plastic bottle on the wooden nightstand, his dark eyes fixed on the patterned carpet beneath his soaked sneakers. I asked him what he was doing there so late and what a bottle of vitamins had to do with the disaster we'd witnessed at the dinner table earlier. Tyler took a slow, shaky breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and finally looked up at me. His eyes were impossibly mature, carrying a heavy burden. "Dad," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "For the past 3 years, I've been keeping tabs on her. I've been watching everything she does. And for the past 3 years, every single day, I've been secretly swapping out the pills Mom gave you every night with these vitamin tablets." Those words hung in the cold air, heavy and incomprehensible. I shook my head, taking a step closer, trying to grasp the severity of what he was saying. I asked him what he meant. Valerie had been giving me my prescribed blood pressure medication, the little white pills my doctor insisted were necessary for my cardiovascular health. Tyler let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Those weren't for your blood pressure, Dad," Tyler said, his voice hardening with suppressed rage. "Not even close. When I was 15, I noticed a locked safe hidden deep in her closet. One afternoon while she was out meeting Derek, I managed to pick the lock. Inside, I found hundreds of little white pills sorted into unlabeled prescription bottles. I took a few and spent days researching their chemical makeup online." Tyler paused, resting his elbows on his knees. "It was high-dose lorazepam," he explained, locking eyes with me, "a powerful, clinical-grade sedative. When given to an older patient in steady, unmonitored doses over a long period, it doesn't just put them to sleep. It actively induces severe cognitive impairment. It perfectly mimics the exact symptoms of early-onset dementia, causing severe memory loss, extreme lethargy, chronic hand tremors, and intense brain fog. She wasn't treating your heart, Dad. She was systematically and deliberately destroying your brain. I froze right where I stood. The sheer terror of his words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the little plastic bottle, then back at my son as wave after wave of realization flooded my mind. Suddenly, every single moment of the last 36 months made complete sense. I remembered every out-of-state business trip I'd taken for conferences or client meetings. Whenever I left our Seattle estate, away from Valerie's reach and staying in hotels, my mind would slowly clear up, the fog would lift, and my hands would stop trembling during presentations. I had always credited those temporary moments of clarity to a change of scenery or getting away from home stress. I never once suspected that I was simply going through chemical withdrawal from heavy clinical sedatives. The scale of the betrayal was almost too massive to process. My own wife, the woman who smiled across the breakfast table at me every morning, was quietly poisoning my mind. The woman who brought me a warm cup of tea every single night had been deliberately poisoning me. She was keeping me in a constant, drug-induced fog just to manufacture a fake medical history. She wanted me confused. She wanted me weak. She needed me to look like a helpless, fading old man, so no judge would ever question her petition for total financial and medical control. An overwhelming wave of gratitude and guilt hit me all at once. I looked at Tyler, my quiet, introverted son, who I thought spent all his time isolated in his bedroom playing video games and checking out from the family. He wasn't ignoring me. He had been quietly saving my life. Every day for 3 long years, a teenage boy had to sneak into his mother's bathroom, take away the toxic sedatives she set out, and replace them with harmless vitamins. He carried the crushing weight of her horrible secret all by himself, protecting my brain and keeping me safe without ever saying a word, just waiting for the right moment to expose her completely. That was why my mind suddenly felt so unbelievably sharp and clear. That was why I had the mental clarity to confront Derek earlier that day. Tyler had saved my sanity. A sudden, violent surge of adrenaline shot through my veins, and my initial shock quickly turned into a blinding, consuming rage. I turned away from Tyler and marched straight toward the closet. I grabbed my heavy wool coat off the hanger, my hands shaking with raw anger. I reached for my car keys on the desk, a million different ways to ruin her flashing through my mind. I turned to Tyler and told him we were leaving the room right now. I was going to drive straight back to that $5 million estate, drag Valerie out of her immaculate bedroom, and call the police on the spot. I was going to have her arrested for attempted murder and maliciously administering unauthorized narcotics. I wanted to watch the authorities drag her out into the pouring rain. I grabbed the brass handle of the door, completely prepared to unleash holy hell. But before I could turn it, Tyler stepped in my way. Moving far faster than I expected, he put himself right between me and the heavy wooden door, blocking my path. He reached out and grabbed my forearm, his grip surprisingly strong as he held me in place. "Not yet, Dad," Tyler said firmly, a quiet but terrifying intensity burning in his dark eyes, matching my own rage. "You can't go to the police right now. The poisoning attempt is horrifying, but if they don't find those physical pills on her, she'll just claim I'm a troubled teenager lying to protect you in a divorce. She'll spin the narrative in a heartbeat, making the authorities believe you're incredibly paranoid, completely unhinged, and dangerously unstable. That is exactly what she wants you to do." I stared down at him, my chest heaving with suppressed fury, demanding to know why on earth we should wait another second to expose a woman who tried to poison me. Tyler slowly let go of my arm, took a long, steady breath, and looked at me with a solemn expression. "Because that's not even the worst part of her plan, Dad," he whispered. "The pills were just a sick, twisted way to keep you compliant. You need to see what she and Derek have actually been doing to your company behind your back. Please, just sit down. You need to see the servers." Tyler pushed past me and placed his heavy black laptop squarely on the small round table near the window. He flipped the screen open, and in an instant, dense streams of scrolling code reflected in his eyes. I sat on the edge of the bed and watched my son navigate the system with a level of speed and technical skill I had completely underestimated. He was a prodigy. I knew he was good with computers. I knew he was good with computers, but I always assumed his talents were limited to gaming or harmless coding projects. I had no idea he was operating at the level of a high-end intelligence analyst. Tyler's fingers flew across the keyboard without him ever looking up. He told me his investigation began 3 years ago, right around the time he turned 15. He had borrowed his mother's unlocked phone to look up a recipe for a school project. While she was in the shower, a notification popped up on her screen. It was an incredibly explicit, deeply disturbing text message, and the sender was none other than Derek Lawson, the chief financial officer I had hired entirely on her strong recommendation. Tyler said that instead of running to me in a panic, he made a very cold, deliberate decision. He quietly forwarded that message to a secure server he had built himself. Over the next few weeks, using his advanced understanding of cybersecurity, he completely cloned her cloud storage drive. He gained real-time access to every text message, email, and digital footprint she generated. But Tyler knew digital records could easily be deleted or dismissed in court as fake. He needed raw, undeniable audio recordings. He confessed that he spent his saved allowance ordering military-grade microphones online. While Valerie was taking me to those endless, exhausting doctor appointments to document my supposed cognitive decline, Tyler was at home unscrewing the wooden baseboards in my study, the dining room, and the master bedroom, burying tiny listening devices deep inside the walls. He had basically turned our massive Seattle estate into a fully functional surveillance network. He hit a key on the keyboard, bringing up a deeply nested folder packed with hundreds of categorized audio files. He hovered the cursor over a file dated just 2 weeks prior. He warned me to brace myself, then hit play. The crisp, crystal-clear sound of my own living room filled the sterile hotel space. I could hear the familiar clinking of crystal wine glasses, followed by the deep, resonant voice of Derek Lawson. Derek was laughing, a rich, arrogant sound that made my stomach turn violently. He was telling Valerie how unbelievably easy it had been to pull the wool over my eyes during the last quarterly financial review. Then I heard my wife's voice. Valerie sounded relaxed, completely free of the stress she always faked around me. She laughed right along with him, calling me a pathetic, gullible old fool. She bragged about how easy it was to get me to swallow the fabricated diagnosis of early-onset dementia. She boasted to Derek that the heavy sedatives were working like a charm, turning my sharp, aggressive business mind into a compliant, forgetful mush. She said she could barely hold back her laughter when the neurologist suggested I hand over financial power of attorney just to reduce my daily stress. Derek told her that her brilliant performance as a grieving, exhausted caregiver deserved an Oscar. They clinked their glass together, raising a sickening toast to my drug-induced decline. I sat on that hotel bed, my hands gripping the thick fabric of the mattress so hard my knuckles throbbed. Hearing her voice, hearing the pure, unadulterated malice and mockery in the very rooms where we were supposed to build a life together, was 1,000 times worse than reading any divorce demand. It was a visceral, deeply humiliating violation. My vision literally blurred from a surge of blinding fury. Every instinct in my 70-year-old body was screaming at me to drive to Derek's upscale condo and tear him apart with my bare hands. I wanted to physically destroy them both, to shatter the arrogant confidence they held, while laughing at my artificially impaired brain. But as the audio file ended and silence flooded back into the hotel room, the cold, calculating logic that had made me a multimillionaire began to override my burning rage. I forced myself to take a slow, rhythmic breath. I looked at the glowing screen of Tyler's laptop and began analyzing the situation with the cold pragmatism I usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. I knew the law. I knew that even though these recordings were an absolute moral victory, they were completely illegal. Tyler was a minor when he installed those wiretaps, and Washington is a strict two-party consent state. If we brought these audio files to a judge or the police, a smart defense attorney would instantly get them thrown out of court as inadmissible evidence obtained through illegal privacy violations. Even worse, they could file criminal charges against my son for unauthorized surveillance and hacking. I couldn't risk Tyler's future just to satisfy my immediate desire for revenge. The wiretaps were a roadmap, but they couldn't be the weapon. If I wanted to completely eradicate Valerie and Derek, I needed something undeniable. I needed a paper trail of rock-solid, admissible financial evidence that no attorney in the country could suppress. I stood up and smoothed out the wrinkles in my coat. I officially shifted from a betrayed, heartbroken husband into a silent, methodical hunter. I told Tyler he had done a brilliant job, but that we had to be extremely careful. Placing my hand on his tired shoulder, I instructed him to go back to the estate and keep playing the exact role he had mastered for the past 3 years. He had to remain the quiet, deeply depressed, completely transparent teenager who spent all his waking hours mindlessly playing video games. He couldn't let his manipulative mother see even a sliver of the dangerous truth hiding in his eyes. He gave a solemn nod, understanding the life-altering weight of our situation. After he quietly slipped out of the room to catch a late-night rideshare, I locked the heavy hotel door, walked straight to the polished wooden desk, and pulled a prepaid, completely untraceable phone out of my leather briefcase, a device I kept specifically for managing sensitive international business negotiations. I dialed a highly secure number I hadn't used in over a decade. It belonged to an elite, ruthless forensic accounting firm headquartered in Chicago. They were an aggressive team made up entirely of former federal agents who specialized in dismantling complex corporate embezzlement networks in absolute secrecy. The burner phone rang just twice before a gruff, familiar voice answered on the encrypted line. I didn't bother with small talk. I gave my full name, provided my unique authorization code, and told him I needed an untraceable deep-dive financial audit launched against my chief financial officer immediately, starting tonight. The silent corporate hunt was officially underway. The auditors I hired from Chicago worked with surgical precision. They didn't touch the physical servers at my office, fearing Derek might have set up automated alerts to catch unauthorized access. Instead, they remotely mirrored my company's data in the dead of night, creating a digital twin of our entire financial infrastructure. I sat in my hotel suite for 3 straight days, watching real-time updates on a secure, encrypted laptop. Every hour felt like a decade while the audit team peeled back the layers of deception Derek and Valerie had spent years constructing. By the second night, the first massive crack in their armor appeared. The auditors bypassed the vague tax filings and tracked outgoing wire transfers straight to 3 LLCs registered in Delaware. They were classic shell companies, entities with no physical offices, no employees, and no actual products. They existed for one purpose only: to serve as high-speed funnels for stolen corporate cash. Over the past 18 months, my firm had paid out nearly $4 million in invoices, all under the guise of third-party IT consulting fees. She is, Dad. I knew my IT infrastructure inside and out, and I knew for a fact that we had never hired outside consultants for anything even close to that volume of work. Derek was simply writing checks to companies controlled personally by him and Valerie, effectively stealing a fortune directly from my bank accounts while pretending it was a legitimate business expense. As the team dug deeper, their motives grew even more sinister. They managed to crack a protected, encrypted file hidden deep within a subdirectory on the project management server. It was a complete business plan for a rival software startup, fully mapped out with our proprietary source code, our unique algorithm designs, and our entire confidential client database. Derek wasn't just stealing cash to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was systematically dismantling my life's work to build his own future. All the pieces suddenly fit together with horrifying clarity. Valerie didn't just want a 60% stake in the divorce to secure her financial future. She wanted that majority vote so she could force a shareholder meeting to liquidate the company. Once the firm was gutted, she and Derek would take over the ruins, absorb my entire market share, and launch their competing venture without having to invent a single thing. They planned to burn my 40 years of hard work to the ground and dance on the ashes using the very resources I provided. As I stared at the screen, a cold, hard numbness spread through my limbs. This wasn't just a brief affair or a petty dispute. It was a calculated, long-term professional execution. My wife and my CFO viewed me as a dying animal, just waiting for me to slowly succumb to induced dementia so they could finish the harvest. I finally understood why Valerie was so desperate to win that guardianship petition. By gaining legal control over my medical decisions and finances, she could lock me away in a private facility to keep me quiet while they quietly picked the company clean. She would control the narrative, the wealth, and my life until my heart finally stopped beating. Just as the lead auditor from Chicago called to confirm they had locked down all the necessary bank records and digital footprints, the phone on the desk vibrated violently. "It's Jonathan, my attorney." His voice was tight and urgent, completely stripped of his usual calm composure. "Richard, we have a massive problem," he said immediately. "I just received an emergency notice from the county court. Valerie isn't just moving forward with the divorce. She just escalated things dramatically. She filed an emergency petition for court-ordered guardianship. She's trying to take over your legal personhood right now, claiming you've completely lost the ability to manage even the most basic elements of daily life. She wants the judge to sign the order as an emergency measure before the divorce trial even begins." I looked at the clock, its red numbers glowing in the dark hotel room. It was nearly 3 in the morning. The city outside was quiet, but my mind was a storm of fierce strategy and cold determination. I told Jonathan I would be at his office at 8 sharp. We weren't playing defense anymore. We were going to give the court something they never saw coming. I had the financial audit. I had the shell company records. Now I was going to use Valerie's own emergency filing as the catalyst to destroy her completely. I was ready to walk into that courtroom and make sure that when the dust finally settled, she was the one who lost everything. The hunt was over. The trap was sprung. At 8 o'clock sharp the next morning, I arrived at Jonathan's office with absolute clarity and an ironclad resolve. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, but the atmosphere inside the polished mahogany conference room was impossibly tense. Jonathan sat rigidly at the long glass table, surrounded by thick legal documents, stamped with official seals from the county court. "He didn't know how she is, Dad." He didn't offer his usual warm greeting. Instead, he looked at me with a grave expression, pushed a thick manila folder across the table, and quietly instructed me to read through the emergency petition. Scanning the dense legal jargon, I watched Valerie paint a horrifying picture of a man teetering on the edge of a total mental breakdown. Her sworn affidavit falsely claimed that I was declining rapidly, suffering severe cognitive meltdowns, and wandering aimlessly around our property late at night. She insisted I was aggressive, highly paranoid, and a direct threat to myself and my company's financial assets. But the most dangerous paper in the entire file was a certified medical report from a private neurologist named Dr. Eris Thorne. Jonathan pointed his silver pen at the signature. His legal team had thoroughly investigated Thorne late the previous night. Thorne operated a highly discreet private medical clinic that catered specifically to ultra-wealthy clients who needed questionable medical evaluations. According to our fast financial tracking, Derek Lawson had authorized a direct $50,000 wire transfer from the corporate account to that private clinic just 3 days prior under the fake label of executive health consulting. Thorne was completely corrupt, accepting a bribe from my CFO to legally declare me as suffering from rapidly deteriorating Alzheimer's disease. The sheer malice of their strategy sent a chill down my spine. Jonathan broke down the exact trap they had set. If the judge granted this emergency guardianship, my life as an independent person would be over. Valerie would immediately gain absolute legal control over my entire existence. She would have the exclusive power to manage my finances, liquidate my investment portfolio, and dictate operational control of my software firm. The guardianship would give her absolute authority over my medical care. She could legally keep me sedated, commit me to a facility, and hold me under heavy medication until I actually lost my mind. I would become a prisoner in my own life, stripped of every basic human right. My immediate reaction was to strike back with overwhelming force. I wanted to slam the forensic audit on the table, showing the judge, the Delaware shell companies, and the $4 million stolen through fake consulting fees. I wanted to bring Tyler into court. To testify about the high-dose lorazepam she had been feeding me. I told Jonathan to file a countersuit immediately, expose their conspiracy, and have the authorities knock on their door. Jonathan slowly shook his head, analyzing the legal battlefield with cold precision. He explained that we couldn't reveal our hand just yet. If we submitted the financial audit right now, Valerie and Derek would destroy offshore accounts, shred physical evidence, and potentially flee the jurisdiction before criminal charges could be finalized. Furthermore, the wiretap recordings were legally inadmissible, and bringing up poisoning allegations without the physical pills would make me look like the paranoid old man Valerie claimed I was. A judge would view my aggressive accusations as textbook symptoms of dementia-induced paranoia. Instead, Jonathan proposed a counterplan that required immense self-control. I had to step right into her trap and let Valerie believe she was winning. The only way to legally dismantle her petition without tipping them off about our financial investigation was to score an absolute victory on the medical claim. Jonathan had already filed a motion demanding an independent neurological evaluation by a court-appointed medical board completely unlinked to Dr. Thorne. I would have to undergo a rigorous, exhaustive cognitive assessment conducted by 3 state-certified specialists. Until that independent evaluation was officially submitted to the court, I had to maintain the absolute illusion that I was weak, fragile, and overwhelmed by stress. I couldn't act like a sharp, vengeful CEO. I had to return to the estate, walk with slow, hesitant steps, and allow Valerie to keep playing her role as the exhausted caregiver. I had to endure her condescending smiles, her fake sympathy, and her manipulative whispers without breaking character. I had to play the victim, knowing that a single slip-up in my act could cause them to panic and liquidate the stolen funds before we could freeze their assets. It was the hardest assignment of my life. For the next 3 days, I lived in a nightmare. I returned to the estate, moving like a ghost through the grand hallways. Whenever Valerie was in the room, I deliberately misplaced my reading glasses. I asked the same question twice. When I held my morning coffee cup, I let my hands tremble slightly. Watching her calm, calculating eyes made my blood boil, but I forced my face to remain relaxed and confused. Tyler played his part perfectly, staying quiet and withdrawn, passing me in the hallway without making eye contact. Pretending to lose my mind in front of the woman actively trying to destroy it was pure torture. By Thursday evening, the tension in the house hit an unbearable peak. The court hearing for the emergency guardianship was scheduled for Friday morning. I was sitting in the study, staring blankly at a book to keep up appearances when Tyler quietly slipped into the room. He shut the heavy mahogany door with a soft click and walked quickly over to my leather chair. His face was pale, his breathing quick and shallow. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers sliding frantically across the glowing screen before handing it to me. His digital monitoring had just intercepted a new encrypted text message sent direct from Valerie's device to Derek's private number. I looked at the screen and read the cold words my wife had just typed. The old man took the bait completely. He's practically a walking corpse today. Once the judge grants the guardianship Friday morning, we cut off his corporate account access. Transfer everything to the Delaware accounts before noon. A cold chill hit my chest. The deadline was locked in, Friday morning. In less than 14 hours, I would be standing before a superior court judge. I had to present the results of my independent medical evaluation, reveal the confidential audit, and blow up the life I had built over the last 20 years. The trap was fully set. The clock was ticking down to the final hours, and there was no turning back now. It was the ultimate showdown for my legacy and my survival. The morning of the medical evaluation arrived with a suffocating weight. I walked into the sterile, brightly lit offices of the state-appointed medical board, knowing my entire future hinged on the next few hours. 3 independent neurologists, completely unaffiliated with Dr. Thorne or his corrupt clinic, subjected me to a rigorous battery of cognitive, psychological, and neurological assessments. They tested my memory, spatial awareness, executive functioning, and verbal fluency. I held nothing back. I answered every question with the sharp, aggressive precision that built my software empire. I detailed complex logistics algorithms, cited my firm's profit margins from the last fiscal quarter down to the last decimal point, and navigated their psychological traps with absolute clarity. When the exhaustive examination finally concluded, the lead neurologist looked at me with deep, complete shock. He stated unequivocally that my brain was not only healthy, but operating at an elite level for a person of any age. There was not a single trace of dementia, Alzheimer's, or cognitive decline. I passed with flying colors. The entire medical foundation of Valerie's guardianship petition had evaporated in an instant. However, Jonathan was a master tactician who understood the power of a strategic ambush. He immediately filed an emergency motion with the presiding judge to strictly seal the official medical results until the actual hearing, citing extreme privacy concerns regarding my corporate standing. The judge agreed. The report proving my absolute health was locked away in a confidential file, effectively keeping my wife completely blind to the truth. Valerie and Derek were allowed to keep operating under the dangerous assumption that their corrupt doctor's report was the only medical evidence the court possessed. We were deliberately leading them straight into a corner with no way out. With the medical trap set, I returned to my hotel room on Thursday evening to make final preparations. Tyler sat at the round table near the window, bathed in the pale glow of his laptop screen. He was systematically transferring data files, his young face tight with a heavy exhaustion no 18-year-old should ever have to carry. I walked over, pulled out the chair across from him, and sat down to look at my son. Really look at him. For the first time in 3 years, the fog was completely gone. With the immediate panic of the financial audit handled, I finally saw the heartbreaking toll this hidden war had taken on him. While his peers were going to high school parties, watching football games, and experiencing the carefree joy of being a teenager, Tyler had lived in a state of constant, terrifying vigilance. Every single night, he had quietly swapped out toxic sedatives to save my brain from permanent chemical damage. He spent his nights compiling massive, encrypted spreadsheets of offshore financial fraud, analyzing obscure corporate tax laws, and listening to endless audio recordings of his own mother plotting to destroy our family. He had effectively lost his mother the moment he discovered her horrific betrayal, sacrificing his youth entirely to protect a heavily medicated father who didn't even realize he was drowning. A deep, overwhelming wave of guilt washed over me. I reached out and gripped his hand tightly, stopping his tired fingers from typing another line of code. I told him how deeply sorry I was, that he had to carry this terrible burden all alone. I told him his brilliant, quiet bravery had saved my life and my legacy. Looking into his tired eyes, I promised him with every ounce of conviction in my soul that his watch was officially over. I swore to him that today we would end this nightmare for good, and that I would never let anyone hurt him again. Tyler swallowed hard, blinked back tears, and simply nodded. A sharp knock at the door broke the emotional silence as Jonathan entered, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. It was time to assemble our ultimate case. We cleared the table and laid out the evidence that would completely destroy Valerie and Derek. Jonathan pulled out the sealed medical evaluation from the state board, proving my flawless cognitive health and instantly exposing Dr. Thorne as a hired fraud. Next came the comprehensive financial audit from the Chicago team. The pages detailed the exact trail of $4 million, meticulously tracking corporate funds stolen from my company straight into the 3 Delaware shell companies controlled by Derek and Valerie. The audit also included the cracked, encrypted business plan, proving their intent to steal my proprietary algorithms and client database to launch a competing firm. Finally, Tyler handed Jonathan a sleek black USB drive. It contained a curated selection of the most damning audio files, specifically formatted to serve as an irrefutable impeachment tool if Valerie attempted to lie under oath about her knowledge of my medical condition or her relationship with Derek. We had the motive, we had the means, and we had the undeniable physical proof of their massive embezzlement and tampered medical history. Every single document was double-checked, indexed, and packed tightly back inside Jonathan's heavy briefcase. We weren't just fighting a divorce lawsuit anymore. We were executing a highly coordinated, completely lethal legal operation. The next morning, the Seattle sky was a fitting shade of cold, concrete gray. When we arrived at the massive concrete steps of the Superior Court, I walked shoulder to shoulder with Jonathan through the heavy glass doors, with Tyler following a few steps behind. As we stepped into the wide, echoing hallway leading to the family court division, I spotted them. Valerie was standing right beside the court's heavy oak doors. She was wearing a remarkably conservative, elegant navy blue dress, her makeup perfectly restrained to project the exact image of a grieving, utterly exhausted, heartbroken wife who had been pushed to her absolute limit. She was gently dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, playing her tragic role flawlessly in front of every passing bailiff and court clerk. Derek was casually sitting nearby on a long wooden bench in the public gallery. He wore a sharp, expensive gray suit, and as his eyes met mine, a slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. Watching my slightly hunched posture, my quiet demeanor, and the tight, grim expression on Jonathan's face, they clearly fell for the entire illusion we had meticulously constructed. They genuinely believed I was a broken, hopelessly confused old man meekly shuffling toward my own financial execution. They truly thought they had already won the war. They had no idea they were standing on a buried landmine, and I was fully prepared to pull the final trigger today. The heavy doors to courtroom 4 swung open, and we filed inside. The atmosphere was suffocating, filled with the quiet, tense chill that comes right before a slaughter. I sat at the defense table, maintaining the posture of a defeated, frail old man. I kept my shoulders slumped, my eyes fixed on the desk, avoiding direct eye contact. Jonathan sat to my left, organizing his legal pads with a practiced, terrifying calm. Tyler took a seat in the very front row of the gallery, blending into the background as a silent observer, though the key to our ultimate victory was sitting right inside his pocket. The bailiff's voice echoed through the room, "Grrr," calling everyone to rise as the Honorable Margaret Caldwell took the bench. She was a stern woman with decades of judicial experience carved into her face. She adjusted her glasses, looked over the thick case file containing the emergency petition, and officially called the court to order. Valerie's attorney, a polished corporate litigator, immediately called his client to the stand. Valerie walked slowly toward the witness box, every step carefully calculated to project deep sorrow and immense exhaustion. She took the oath, sat down, and launched into the absolute masterclass of emotional manipulation she had been rehearsing. Guided by her attorney's gentle, leading questions, Valerie began to cry. They weren't loud, dramatic sobs, but quiet, steady tears she wiped away with a practiced hand. Speaking to the judge in a trembling voice, she detailed what she categorized as my steep cognitive decline. She spun an elaborate, painful story about how the mind of a brilliant husband was rapidly evaporating into a fog of paranoia and confusion. She described fictional nights where I supposedly wandered around our estate, unable to recognize my surroundings, screaming at invisible enemies. She painted a horrifying picture of me as an erratic man who posed a direct lethal danger to himself and to the massive commercial empire he had built. With her voice cracking on cue, she begged the judge to grant the emergency guardianship immediately. She claimed she couldn't bear to watch my life's work get systematically destroyed by my failing brain. She argued that transferring 60% of the company's equity into her exclusive control wasn't born out of greed, but out of a desperate, protective need. She claimed she needed the voting rights to protect my employees, secure our son's future, and shield my legacy from my own dementia-driven, erratic decisions. The narrative was flawless. If I didn't know the sinister truth, I might have actually believed the tragedy she was selling. I risked a quick glance toward the gallery. Derek was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, watching Valerie with absolute admiration. He was practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction. As Valerie finished her tearful testimony and stepped down from the stand, the sympathetic eyes of the entire courtroom followed her. Next, her attorney called their star witness. Dr. Eris Thorne walked through the swinging doors with the total confidence of a man accustomed to being believed without question. He stepped into the witness box and presented his medical credentials to the court. Speaking in a smooth, authoritative tone, he stripped all the emotion from the room and replaced it with cold, clinical certainty. Under oath and under the direct penalty of perjury, this corrupt neurologist testified that he had examined me multiple times over the past 6 months. Looking Judge Caldwell straight in the eye, he declared that I was suffering from aggressive, late-stage Alzheimer's disease. He used complex medical terminology to describe my supposed cognitive deficits, citing severe memory loss, a total lack of executive function, and a complete inability to comprehend complex financial realities. He testified that the disease was progressing unusually fast and was entirely irreversible. He concluded that without immediate, aggressive intervention through full legal guardianship, I would inevitably cause catastrophic financial harm to my entire estate. He told the judge that placing me under Valerie's complete control was the only medically ethical and legally responsible path forward. It was a masterclass in medical perjury, funded directly by the corporate accounts they were trying to steal. After Dr. Thorne wrapped up his devastating testimony, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom. The air felt thick, uncomfortable, and utterly hopeless. Judge Caldwell slowly shifted her gaze toward my side of the room. Her stern eyes were now filled with deep, silent pity. She looked at me not as a respected CEO, but as a tragic, fading ghost, a man who could no longer defend himself against time and disease. That was the exact response Valerie had engineered. The judge cleared her throat and looked straight at my attorney. She asked Jonathan if he wished to cross-examine the witness. Normally, a defense attorney would tear into the doctor's credentials, demand a second opinion, or challenge the findings. But Jonathan did nothing of the sort. He sat quietly, his hands resting flat on his pristine briefcase. He slowly stood up, buttoned his suit jacket with a calm, deliberate motion, and looked directly at the bench. In a clear, steady voice, he stated that he had no questions for the witness. He told the judge that the defense waived its right to cross-examine Dr. Thorne. A ripple of genuine shock ran through the courtroom. Valerie's attorney blinked, caught completely off guard by what looked like total surrender. Dr. Thorne looked almost offended as he awkwardly excused himself from the stand. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Valerie. Her brow furrowed in deep confusion, and she quickly exchanged an anxious glance with Derek in the gallery. This was not how their script was supposed to go. They expected desperate, screaming resistance from us. They expected me to throw a temper tantrum that would prove my paranoia, fighting back with the chaotic energy of a confused, terrified old man. Our deafening silence rattled them, but as the initial shock faded, the confusion on Valerie's face melted back into a triumphant, satisfied smile. She convinced herself that we had given up, believing we saw her overwhelming medical evidence, and surrendered. Judge Caldwell let out a soft, resigned sigh. She adjusted her reading glasses and reached for her pen, ready to sign the emergency guardianship order that would strip away my freedom as an independent man. She looked down at Jonathan and asked if the defense had any closing remarks or final submissions before the court ruled on the immediate transfer of corporate equity and medical control. Jonathan didn't hesitate for a single second. He didn't ask for a recess. He didn't beg for leniency. He stepped out from behind the heavy oak defense table and walked straight into the center of the quiet courtroom. The atmosphere instantly shifted, the air charging with electric tension. Looking straight at the judge, his voice echoed off the high walls. "Your Honor," he announced, all trace of defeat instantly vanishing from his tone, "we reject this fraudulent petition for emergency guardianship entirely. We utterly reject all proposed divorce settlement demands. And at this time, we call our first and only witness to the stand, my client's son, Tyler Harrison." The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom seemed to absorb the collective gasp that echoed from the gallery as my son stood up. Tyler looked nothing like the timid, depressed teenager Valerie had grown used to ignoring. He looked tall, composed, and possessed a quiet strength that mirrored the very best parts of my younger self. He walked down the center aisle, his footsteps falling in a steady rhythm against the polished marble floor. Valerie instantly shifted in her seat, her tearful caregiver mask slipping for a fraction of a second to reveal sharp, calculating panic underneath. Realizing the sudden shift in narrative, her attorney jumped to his feet, wildly objecting to Jonathan calling Tyler to testify. He argued that a teenager was completely inappropriate for a complex financial guardianship hearing, claiming that dragging a child into a bitter marital dispute was improper and emotionally damaging. Judge Caldwell looked over the top of her glasses, her expression hardening into absolute authority. She struck her gavel, a sharp crack that silenced the desperate attorney instantly and firmly overruled the objection. She stated that Tyler was legally an adult and fully capable of providing sworn testimony if the defense deemed it relevant. As Tyler stepped into the witness box and raised his right hand to be sworn in, Valerie's eyes locked onto him. She leaned forward slightly, forcing a sickeningly sweet maternal smile onto her face. She silently mouthed the words, "It's okay." She clearly thought her son was simply terrified, fragile, and too broken by her years of psychological dominance to ever speak out against her in open court. She expected him to crumble under the pressure. She was dead wrong. Before Jonathan asked Tyler a single question, he turned his attention back to Judge Caldwell. Reaching into his leather briefcase, he pulled out a heavy manila envelope sealed with red wax and stamped with the official seal of the State Medical Board. Jonathan walked up to the bench and handed the file directly to the judge. For the official record, he announced that he was submitting a comprehensive, independent neurological evaluation. He specifically noted that this examination had been conducted just 48 hours prior by a panel of 3 highly respected, state-certified neurologists. Judge Caldwell broke the wax seal, her brow furrowing deeply as she pulled out the crisp documents. A breathless, suffocating silence fell over the courtroom as she read through the findings. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the pages. The deep pity she had previously held for me completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, radiating judicial fury. The State Board had reached an unequivocal conclusion. My brain function was exceptionally healthy, fully optimal, and showed absolutely zero signs of cognitive decline, dementia, or Alzheimer's disease. Jonathan slowly turned around and looked straight at Dr. Thorne, who was still awkwardly lingering near the petitioner's table. Jonathan casually asked the judge if she would like to reconcile the State Board's flawless medical report with the terrifyingly grim prognosis Dr. Thorne had just delivered under penalty of perjury. Dr. Thorne recoiled as if he'd been struck. The arrogant, smooth composure he had displayed minutes earlier completely shattered, and heavy beads of sweat broke out across his forehead. He practically scrambled toward the heavy oak doors, the terrifying weight of his legal exposure crashing down on him. Valerie stared at the fleeing doctor in utter horror, her primary medical foundation pulverized in a matter of seconds. With the medical narrative completely dismantled, Jonathan turned his calculating gaze toward the witness stand. He asked Tyler to explain precisely why Dr. Thorne might have been given a financial motive to lie. Tyler gripped the edge of the wooden witness stand, his knuckles white, and took a deep breath. He spoke in a voice so clear it cut through the room like a razor. Under oath, he testified that he had spent the last 3 years systematically investigating his own mother. He detailed the exact afternoon when he was 15 years old and picked the lock on the metal box hidden deep inside her closet. He described finding hundreds of unlabeled white pills. He explained to the silent room how he meticulously researched the chemical composition of those pills, discovering they were high-dose lorazepam. Jonathan prompted him to explain the medical function of that specific drug. Tyler looked straight at Judge Caldwell and stated that it was a powerful clinical sedative designed to induce severe memory loss, chronic lethargy, heavy brain fog, and intense neurological confusion. It was a chemical poison designed to precisely mimic the symptoms of rapid-onset dementia. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Valerie's attorney slumped into his leather chair, his face turning pale as he realized the terrifying scope of the criminal conspiracy he had unknowingly stepped into. Jonathan then asked the most critical question of the morning. He asked Tyler what he did with that horrifying information. Tyler looked across the room, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an unspoken bond of love and absolute loyalty. He told the judge he knew that if he went to the police without hard proof, his mother would easily spin a lie and dismiss him as a troubled teenager. So, he made a silent, painful choice. Every single night for 36 consecutive months, he snuck into the master bathroom, carefully removed the toxic sedatives his mother laid out for my nightly routine, and meticulously swapped them with harmless vitamin tablets of the exact same size and shape. He testified that he spent his entire high school life guarding my brain, effectively keeping me alive and fully coherent while Valerie actively tried to chemically destroy me. The sheer impact of Tyler's testimony shattered the room's decorum. The horrifying reality of a mother slowly poisoning her husband while her teenage son fought a secret, desperate war to save him hung heavily in the air. Valerie snapped. The elaborate act of the grieving wife evaporated instantly. She surged out of her chair, her face contorting into a mask of pure rage. Pointing a trembling finger at the witness stand, she began screaming at the top of her lungs, screeching that Tyler was a filthy liar. She wildly accused me of brainwashing our son, screaming that I had poisoned his mind against her just to protect my precious software empire. She hysterically demanded that the judge strike his testimony from the official record. Judge Caldwell slammed her heavy wooden gavel repeatedly, demanding order in her courtroom, but Valerie was completely unhinged. Amid the deafening chaos, Tyler remained absolutely still. He didn't flinch, and he didn't look away. He looked down at his screaming mother with eyes as cold and unforgiving as ice. Reaching slowly into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small black digital recording device. He held it up for the entire courtroom to see, his voice cutting through her hysterical screams with terrifying precision. "I knew you were going to say that, Mom." Tyler's voice was remarkably steady, revealing no fear, only the resolved calm of a young man who had spent 3 years preparing for this exact confrontation. He held the recorder high in the air, its black casing reflecting the overhead lights. Valerie stopped screaming instantly. Her mouth remained open, but no sound came out as she stared at the device. The chaotic noise evaporating from the room was replaced by a suffocating tension. Tyler turned away from his mother and looked up at the bench. Speaking politely to Judge Caldwell, his tone was respectful but firm, as he requested permission to submit the audio files as direct evidence. He stated that these recordings would permanently clarify his mother's true intentions and prove she had committed perjury. Valerie's attorney lunged across his desk, waving his hands frantically as he shouted a string of panicked objections. He argued that the audio was unverified, lacked foundation, and was highly prejudicial, claiming that playing the recordings violated every rule of evidence. Judge Caldwell didn't even look at him. Her eyes were fixed on Valerie, her face a mask of penetrating suspicion. Having just received an airtight medical evaluation that exposed a corrupt doctor, her patience was completely exhausted. She struck her gavel once, a sharp crack that silenced the attorney on the spot, and firmly overruled the objection, noting that given the severity of the medical tampering allegations, she would allow the evidence. She instructed the bailiff to retrieve the device from Tyler and connect it directly to the courtroom's audio system. The bailiff walked to the stand, took the recorder from Tyler, and moved toward the clerk's desk. The entire courtroom watched in absolute silence as an audio cable was plugged into the device. A faint hum came from the overhead speakers, indicating the system was live, and Tyler instructed the bailiff to play the file. The button was pressed, and for a brief second, there was only static. Then, a voice echoed through the high ceilings, exceptionally clear, unmistakably distinct, and utterly devastating. It was Valerie's voice, completely stripped of the tragic tone she had used on the witness stand. Instead, she sounded impatient, annoyed, and utterly ruthless. "Increase his dose," my wife's recorded voice commanded, the sound bouncing off the walls. "The old fool is still asking questions about the accounts. I need him completely compliant before the board meeting." The sheer malice of the recording hit the courtroom like a physical shockwave. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Valerie's attorney collapsed back into his chair, dropping his pen onto the desk, visibly sickened as he realized his client had just confessed to intentional poisoning on tape. Valerie sat frozen at the petitioner's table, all color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow porcelain doll. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned translucent white. She couldn't speak, unable to construct a single lie to defend the sound of her own voice, casually ordering the chemical destruction of her husband's mind. I sat at the defense table, keeping my posture rigid as I watched the truth of her actions laid bare. Before anyone in the room could recover from the sheer horror of that first recording, Tyler quietly leaned toward the microphone on the stand and instructed the bailiff to play the second file. The bailiff, eyes wide with shock, quickly tapped the console. Faint static hissed again, and then a new voice boomed through the speakers, a deep, arrogant, confident tone I had heard in countless executive meetings. It was unequivocally the voice of my CFO, Derek Lawson. "I transferred the last $1.2 million through the Delaware LLC," Derek's recorded voice said, dripping with absolute smugness. "Once the divorce is finalized and you get his 60% stake, we liquidate, crash the stock, and migrate the clients to our new servers." That blatant confession was absolute ruin. It wasn't just an admission of a marital betrayal. It was a complete closing argument for a massive, highly coordinated corporate embezzlement scheme. In less than 20 seconds of audio, Derek had confessed to wire fraud, establishing illegal shell companies, corporate espionage, and a deliberate plot to bankrupt my software firm. He effectively admitted that the entire divorce and guardianship petition was nothing more than a legal smokescreen designed to facilitate a hostile takeover and subsequent liquidation of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. The recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were using the judicial system itself as a tool for massive corporate theft. The sheer scale of their greed was staggering, exposing criminal actions that went far beyond the boundaries of a family court dispute. As the audio file snapped shut, the soft click of the playback stopping sounded like a gunshot in the cavernous room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and deeply shocking. Nobody moved and nobody breathed. Judge Caldwell sat high on her bench, her face transformed into a portrait of unyielding stone, the initial suspicion in her eyes hardening into a cold, burning fury. She looked down at Valerie with profound disgust, realizing the weeping, tragic woman standing before her was actually a ruthless architect of psychological torture and massive financial fraud. The entire facade of the exhausted caregiver had been burned to ash. I slowly turned my head away from the bench and shifted my gaze toward the public gallery behind the wooden partition. Derek Lawson wasn't smirking anymore. The arrogant, untouchable confidence he held just 10 minutes prior had completely vanished. His face was ashen pale, covered in a cold sheen of sweat. He looked like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the tracks with a massive freight train speeding right toward him. He knew his career, his freedom, and his entire life were effectively over. Moving with slow, terrified caution, Derek attempted to slip away. He quietly pushed himself up from the wooden bench, keeping his head down, desperately trying to slide toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom before the judge could address the audio. He thought he could simply walk out of the building and disappear into the rain, but he was dead wrong. Jonathan had been anticipating this exact moment. Before Derek could take 3 steps toward his exit, my attorney rose smoothly from the defense table. Without looking at Valerie or the judge, Jonathan turned around, raised his arm, and pointed his silver pen straight across the room at the fleeing CFO. His voice rang out with terrifying authority, slicing through the stunned silence of the courtroom. "Bailiffs, I strongly suggest you do not let that man leave this room," Jonathan commanded, his tone echoing off the marble floor. "I have just submitted a 400-page forensic audit detailing massive, systematic wire fraud directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The absolute weight of Jonathan's statement hung in the suffocating air, sealing the exit with an impenetrable wall of legal ruin. I shifted my focus from Derek back to my wife. Valerie sat completely rigid at the petitioner's table as the terrifying reality of her situation finally hit her like a tidal wave. The perfect mask of the tragic, exhausted caregiver shattered into a million jagged pieces, exposing the raw, unadulterated panic of a cornered predator. She looked frantically at her high-priced corporate attorney, searching for some miraculous legal loophole, any desperate objection that could somehow walk back her own recorded confession. But her attorney had already physically distanced himself, pushing his leather chair inches away from her, staring at the polished mahogany table with a look of sheer shock as he realized his own career was now in serious jeopardy. Valerie's chest began to heave, her breathing coming in short, irregular gasps as her eyes darted wildly around the room. She looked toward Judge Caldwell, whose face remained a stone mask of righteous fury. She looked toward me, finding me sitting tall, fully coherent, and completely free of the drug-induced fog she had tried so desperately to trap me in. Finally, she looked at our son. Tyler stood tall and unyielding in the witness box, his dark eyes looking right through her, completely devoid of the fear and submission she had relied on for years. In that precise fraction of a second, the full impact of her total, irreversible defeat registered in her mind. Her entire life, the stolen wealth, the luxurious estate, and the absolute control she craved were completely gone. You know how she is, Dad. Every remaining shred of reason and logic abandoned her, and driven by a primal instinct to escape the inevitable consequences of her horrific actions, Valerie completely broke down. She slammed her heavy wooden chair backward, its legs screeching violently against the polished marble floor. Her attorney reached out, grabbing her forearm and issuing frantically hushed whispers, desperately urging her to sit down and keep quiet. Valerie ignored him entirely. She viciously yanked her arm free from his grip, ripping the delicate fabric of her elegant navy blue dress in the process. Turning her back on the judge, the witness stand, and the overwhelming evidence of her crimes, she bolted for the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The hectic, chaotic clatter of her expensive heels against the polished stone floor echoed through the stunned, silent room like rapid gunfire. It was a pathetic, completely irrational attempt to escape. There was nowhere to run. She couldn't outrun a federal indictment. She couldn't outrun the evaluation of the state medical board. And she certainly couldn't outrun the audio recording of her own voice, ordering the slow chemical execution of her husband. Yet she ran with the desperate, thrashing energy of a trapped animal, her once perfectly styled hair falling wildly across her face, while her breathing devolved into sharp, hysterical sobs. She made it about halfway down the center aisle, her eyes fixed blindly on the exit, when the swift, uncompromising arm of the law intercepted her path. A towering, heavily built court bailiff moved with practiced, absolute efficiency. He stepped directly into the aisle, firmly blocking her frantic escape route. When Valerie tried to violently push past him, he reached out, securing a rock-solid grip on her upper arm, his grip locking around her like a steel vise. The sudden physical restraint shattered whatever tiny shred of sanity she had left, and she launched into a complete meltdown right in the middle of the court. She thrashed wildly in the bailiff's grip, her arms flailing as her manicured nails clawed desperately at the air. Throwing her head back, she began screaming in a bone-chilling, guttural tone that chilled my blood. She screeched that the recordings were completely illegal, that her son had no right to record inside her private home, and that the entire proceeding was a giant, fabricated setup. Completely dropping any pretense of innocence, she screamed that she deserved every single dime of my company's equity. She wailed that I had prioritized my software empire over her, calling me a negligent husband, and insisting she was simply taking the financial compensation she was owed for enduring our marriage. Her hysterical, self-serving justifications bounced off the high ceiling, a grotesque symphony of pure, unadulterated greed and absolute narcissism. Judge Caldwell leaned far forward over her high bench, her face burning with deep judicial fury. She grabbed her heavy wooden gavel and brought it down on the sound block with a deafening, authoritative crack. Pounding the gavel repeatedly, her voice booming over Valerie's frantic shrieks, the judge found my wife in direct contempt of court on the spot. She ordered the bailiffs to subdue the petitioner and force her into the nearest chair. The bailiff swiftly maneuvered Valerie back toward the gallery, pressing her down onto a hard wooden bench while she continued to weep openly and struggle against his grip. The utter chaos of her mental breakdown stood in stark, magnificent contrast to the profound, calculating silence I maintained at the defense table. As the bailiffs worked to fully restrain my hysterical wife, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a heavy thud. The sudden movement instantly drew the attention of everyone in the room. Two tall, broad-shouldered men dressed in dark, conservative suits stepped decisively across the threshold, carrying stern, completely uncompromising expressions. When Jonathan mentioned a federal forensic audit, he wasn't bluffing, and he certainly didn't leave the timing of their intervention to chance. He had coordinated this exact moment with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Bypassing the chaotic scene in the center aisle, the two agents walked with mechanical precision straight toward the public gallery. Derek Lawson, who had been frozen in a state of terrified paralysis ever since Jonathan singled him out, tried to press his back flat against the wooden bench, desperately searching for a way to melt into the shadows. The lead agent stopped right in front of my CFO. Reaching into his suit jacket, he pulled out a gleaming silver badge, stating his name and federal affiliation in a crisp, authoritative tone. Without waiting for Derek to respond, the second agent gripped Derek's shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. The heavy, metallic click of cold steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Derek's wrists sounded remarkably crisp over Valerie's fading sobs. Derek didn't fight back. He didn't utter a single word of protest. The arrogant, untouchable corporate thief simply slumped his shoulders, his head falling forward in a posture of complete, absolute defeat. They turned him around and swiftly escorted him out of the courtroom, permanently removing the man who had actively plotted to steal my life's work. The judge looked down from the bench. Mrs. Harrison, this is no longer a divorce hearing. This is now a federal crime scene. The sharp crack of her gavel served as the final nail in the coffin of Valerie's elaborate plot. The courtroom, which just an hour ago was the stage for her grand, tearful performance, instantly transformed into a sterile holding area. 2 armed court bailiffs flanked her, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Valerie was stripped completely of her upper-class elegance. Her navy blue dress was torn at the seams from her pathetic escape attempt, and her face was streaked with smeared mascara. She stared at me, her eyes filled with a wild, animalistic terror as the bailiff secured her arms behind her back and snapped cold steel handcuffs onto her wrists. The metallic click resonated in the heavy silence of the room. This time, she didn't scream. The overwhelming weight of federal wire fraud charges finally shattered her illusion of invincibility. With terrifying clarity, she realized that her life, as she knew it, was completely over. Jonathan leaned against our defense table, watching her get led out the door with professional satisfaction. He quietly informed me that the divorce proceedings had been stayed immediately and indefinitely. The family court no longer held primary jurisdiction. Valerie was now actively facing a massive federal criminal investigation, while her fraudulent petition demanding 60% of my company's equity was completely incinerated by the consequences of her own felony actions. When the sun rose the next morning, it illuminated a dramatically different reality. I drove to the sleek glass and steel headquarters of my software company, no longer the frail, medicated, confused old man Valerie had tried so hard to manufacture, but the undisputed master of my commercial domain. Keeping my chest high and my head up, a cold, calculating fire burning in my chest, I walked through the sliding front doors. I was immediately flanked by my head of corporate security and a team of 4 imposing guards. Bypassing the executive elevators, we walked straight toward the expansive finance department, where Derek Lawson had held absolute, unquestioned authority for the past 3 years. The moment I crossed the threshold, a terrified silence fell over the entire floor. The loyal accountants and junior analysts, who had actively assisted him with fraudulent wire transfers, looked up from their glowing monitors, the color completely draining from their faces. I didn't raise my voice, nor did I display a single shred of anger. I spoke with quiet, lethal precision. I ordered the security team to lock down every single computer terminal on the floor immediately. Standing in the center of the room, I announced the immediate, unconditional termination of Derek's entire department. I watched as security handed them cardboard boxes and escorted them out of the building, permanently cleansing my company of the infection. At the same time, Jonathan and his aggressive team of corporate litigators launched a massive, crushing legal strike. They immediately filed civil lawsuits against the 3 Delaware LLCs Derek and Valerie had secretly established to funnel and hide my stolen wealth. Armed with the comprehensive forensic audit from Chicago and the recorded confessions played in open court, Jonathan secured emergency judicial injunctions without sweat. Within hours, we successfully froze every bank account, seized every offshore asset, and completely locked down all the funds they had desperately tried to steal. They couldn't move a single dime, nor could they hire expensive defense attorneys to protect themselves from the coming storm. We effectively cut off their financial oxygen, leaving them utterly paralyzed and completely at the mercy of the federal justice system. The swift, brutal retribution didn't stop with my treacherous wife and corrupt CFO. The spotlight of federal scrutiny turned directly onto Dr. Eris Thorne, the arrogant neurologist who had willingly sold his medical ethics for a $50,000 corporate wire transfer. The total destruction of his career was swift, relentless, and highly public. The moment Jonathan handed the state medical board the independent neurological evaluation proving my flawless cognitive health, Dr. Thorne was exposed as a hired fraud. The state medical board held an emergency disciplinary hearing, permanently revoking his license to practice medicine. But professional disgrace was only the beginning of his nightmare. Federal prosecutors, holding an undeniable paper trail linking his private clinic directly to Derek Lawson and the stolen corporate funds, slapped Thorne with severe, multi-count criminal indictments for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and major medical malpractice. The exclusive, highly secretive clinic that catered to the corrupt elite folded overnight. Federal agents raided his offices, seizing patient files and hard drives. The man who had confidently stepped onto the witness stand, prepared to condemn a perfectly healthy man to a psychiatric ward, was now facing over a decade in federal prison. He lost his flawless reputation, along with his massive fortune and freedom, completely ruined by his own profound greed. By late Friday night, the chaotic adrenaline-fueled storm of the past 48 hours finally began to settle into a quiet, lingering calm. I sat in my familiar leather chair in the home study, looking out the large bay window at the dark outline of the pine trees bordering the estate. Tyler sat across from me, a deep, undeniable sense of relief washing over his young face. The massive, overwhelming burden he had carried in absolute secrecy for over 3 years was finally lifted from his shoulders. We were quietly discussing his college plans, talking about a bright, unburdened future, when the sharp ring of the telephone suddenly shattered the silence. I looked at the caller ID screen on the desk. It displayed a generic automated notification indicating a call from the county correctional facility. I slowly reached out, lifted the heavy receiver to my ear, and pressed the button to accept the collect call. An automated electronic voice stated, "I had a collect call from an inmate." Then the line clicked through, and a voice pierced through the static. It was Valerie. However, that was no longer the commanding, arrogant voice of the woman demanding my absolute submission. Nor was it the smooth, manipulative tone of the tragic wife performing for a sympathetic judge. It was a small, broken, thoroughly defeated voice. She was crying, her breath catching in desperate, irregular gasps as the terrifying reality of a cold, concrete cell pressed down on her. "Richard," she pleaded, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated panic. "Please, you have to help me. They've frozen everything. I have absolutely nothing left. I'm begging you. Please drop the civil lawsuits against those accounts. I need money to hire a criminal defense attorney. If you don't unfreeze those assets, I'll be forced to take a public defender, and they're going to put me away for decades. Please, Richard, I'll sign whatever plea deal you want. I'll give you whatever you ask for. Just please, don't leave me in a place like this to die." I didn't answer her desperate pleading over the phone. Instead, I simply cut the connection, letting the heavy dial tone serve as my initial response. However, I knew a phone call wasn't the right way to close a 20-year marriage that ended in such profound betrayal. I needed to look into her eyes one last time. I needed to see the absolute reality of her defeat with my own eyes. The next morning, I drove through the thick Seattle morning fog toward the county correctional facility. The building was a massive, brutalist structure of gray concrete and coiled razor wire, completely devoid of the warmth and luxury Valerie had ruthlessly pursued her entire life. After passing through strict security checkpoints, I was led down a long, sterile hallway smelling faintly of industrial bleach and stale despair. I was guided into a small, high-security visitation booth, separated down the middle by a thick sheet of bulletproof glass. Overhead fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous drone, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the small metal stool waiting for me. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy, filled with the anguish of countless broken lives. Yet, for the first time in 3 years, my own mind felt perfectly clear, completely free of shadows. A few minutes later, a heavy steel door on the other side of the glass opened with a loud, mechanical click. A stern, female guard escorted Valerie into the small space. The transformation was absolute shock. The elegant, highly sophisticated woman who once controlled upper-class dinner parties and effortlessly intimidated corporate executives was completely gone. She wore a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that swallowed her frame and emphasized her slumped shoulders. Her face was entirely stripped of the expensive cosmetics and luxurious treatments she used to rely on. Like someone who had shed her armor, she looked remarkably hollow, pale, and deeply aged. The confident spark in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by the wide, frantic gaze of a trapped animal. Her hair, usually styled to absolute perfection, was pulled back into a messy, untidy knot. Her posture had completely lost its usual arrogant stiffness, making her look small, fragile, and utterly pathetic. She sat down slowly on the metal stool and picked up the black telephone handset with violently trembling hands. I picked up the receiver on my side and looked directly through the thick, smudged glass at the woman who had secretly plotted to chemically erase my mind. Her eyes were bloodshot and swollen, reflecting a pure, unadulterated terror she had never experienced in her pampered, protected life. "Richard," she whispered, her voice cracking as hot tears immediately streamed down her sunken cheeks. "Thank God you came. Please, you have to listen to me. I'm terrified. Derek manipulated me completely. He kept telling me the company was going under, that you were making terrible decisions, and that we were going to lose absolutely everything we built. I just wanted to protect our family and our financial future." She pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass, looking at me with a desperate, deeply calculated expression of intense sorrow. "We were married for 20 years, Richard. 20 years of a good life shared together. We built an incredible home. We raised our precious son together. You can't just throw all of that away over a terrible, misguided mistake. Think about Tyler. Think about what a massive, highly publicized criminal trial will do to him. The media spectacle will completely ruin his future." She was weeping openly now, letting heavy tears fall freely, desperately trying to use the very son she had emotionally terrorized as one last pathetic bargaining chip to secure her freedom. After everything she put him through, the sheer nerve it took to bring up his name was breathtaking. I looked at her without a single shred of pity. The intense anger that had sustained me for months, the burning rage that drove my silent performance at home, had completely burned out, leaving behind a cold, absolute, laser-focused void. "Valerie, you didn't just try to steal my money," I stated, my voice echoing through the plastic receiver with quiet, lethal precision. "You tried to steal my mind, my dignity, and my entire life. You systematically fed me poison while looking me in the eye with a warm smile. You turned our son's home into a staging ground for a murder. You forced a brilliant teenager to fight a secret, terrifying war in the shadows just to keep his father alive." She opened her mouth to argue, her face twisting in denial, but I immediately raised my hand to silence her pathetic rebuttal. "You get absolutely no deal from me. There will be no backroom negotiations, no generous financial settlement, and absolutely no forgiveness of any kind. Jonathan is working directly and aggressively with federal prosecutors, and we are pursuing the maximum statutory penalties for massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted poisoning. You will face every single devastating consequence of your horrific actions, and you will face them completely alone." The absolute weight of my words hit her like a physical force. Her mouth opened in a silent, agonized shriek as that final, inevitable realization set in. She slammed her fists wildly against the thick, unyielding glass, begging, pleading, and hysterically promising to give me absolutely anything I wanted if I would just drop the civil lawsuits and unfreeze her stolen assets. She wailed that she would sign everything over to me, that she would leave the state, and that she would never bother us again if only I would save her from the cold reality of a federal prison cell. I didn't say another word to her. I maintained a cold, steady glare, letting her see for one long, final second what was missing in the man she thought she had destroyed. Then, I slowly and deliberately placed the heavy black handset back onto its metal base, instantly severing her frantic, pathetic hysteria. Outside the glass on my side, the absolute silence was incredibly empowering. I stood up smoothly from the metal stool, turned my back on the secure visitation booth, and walked down the long, echoing concrete corridor. I didn't look back, but I could clearly feel her crying violently against the cold glass, sliding down to the floor in total, absolute ruin. My steps were remarkably steady as I walked out of that dark, miserable facility and stepped back into the cool, crisp Seattle morning air. I drove back to the sprawling estate in complete, absolute silence. Navigating carefully through the tall iron gates, I parked the car and walked slowly through the heavy wooden front door. I stood in the echoing foyer of the massive, empty mansion. The air felt completely different now. The toxic, manipulative tension that had poisoned it for so long had been thoroughly cleansed. The dark war was finally over, but the vast battlefield was remarkably quiet. I took a long, steady breath. It was time to rebuild. Once the parasitic infection was surgically removed, the process of rebuilding the company moved with remarkable speed. Derek Lawson had spent years quietly draining our resources, funneling our quarterly profits through his labyrinth of illegal offshore accounts and fabricated shell companies. With him permanently locked away in a federal holding cell, the financial hemorrhaging stopped instantly. I appointed a brilliant, thoroughly vetted team of independent forensic accountants to completely restructure our internal oversight protocols. We aggressively pursued the frozen assets, successfully repatriating every single stolen dollar back into the corporate treasury. Without Derek's constant, calculated drain on our capital, the company didn't just stabilize. It experienced a pure explosive surge in revenue like never before. Our stock valuation climbed to all-time highs within weeks, proving that the foundation of my life's work had remained rock solid all along. But I was no longer willing to leave my own legacy exposed to the dangerous vulnerabilities of standard corporate governance. I hired the most ruthless estate attorneys in the country to establish a completely impenetrable, ironclad financial trust. I locked every share of corporate stock, every real estate deed, and every liquid asset behind a fortress of complex legal barriers. The trust structure was specifically engineered with multi-layered biometric security and independent board approvals to guarantee that Valerie, Derek, or any of their corrupt associates could never touch a single dime of my wealth ever again. My empire was finally, permanently shielded from any future external threats or internal sabotage. The absolute sense of relief from knowing that the fruits of my decades of exhausting labor were completely protected allowed me to finally breathe easy. It was a profound victory, measured not just by the millions recovered, but by the absolute, unquestioned sovereignty over my company's destiny, ensuring my wealth would remain perfectly safe from greedy corporate vultures forever. With the corporate battlefield cleared and my financial legacy securely locked away, I felt a desperate need to step away from the sterile, high-pressure environments of boardrooms and courtrooms. I needed to reconnect with the most important person in my world. Early one Saturday morning, before the bright sun had fully crested the horizon, Tyler and I drove out to a quiet, secluded lake deep within the dense evergreen forests of the Cascade Mountains. The air was incredibly crisp and clean, carrying the fresh scent of pine needles and damp earth. A thick blanket of silver mist glided like glass over the dark, tranquil water. It was a striking, beautiful, and profound contrast to the suffocating tension and artificial fluorescent lights we had endured for the past 3 years. Together, we sat in a small wooden boat, its gentle, rhythmic rocking matching the calm cadence of our casting lines. For a long time, we just sat in deeply comforting silence, listening to the soft, rhythmic splash of fishing lures breaking the water and the distant haunting call of a lonely loon echoing through the towering trees. I turned my head slowly to look directly at my remarkable son. He was gazing across the calm lake, the harsh, defensive tension finally melted completely from his broad shoulders. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, invigorating air fill my aging lungs, and looked him straight in the eye. I told him softly that words would never be enough to express my absolute, boundless gratitude. I thanked him from the bottom of my heart for his unyielding courage, for bravely fighting a terrifying war in the shadows, and for literally saving my entire life when I was completely defenseless. Tyler set his fishing rod down, his dark eyes meeting mine with a quiet, profound maturity that no teenager should ever be forced to develop. I clearly saw the lingering ghosts of his anxiety, the invisible scars left by the psychological torture his mother had inflicted. Reaching across the small boat, I pressed my right hand firmly onto his shoulder, needing him to understand that the dark chapter of his young life was permanently closed. I told him he no longer needed to carry the overwhelming, suffocating weight of the world on his shoulders. He didn't have to be my secret protector, my hidden investigator, or the silent guardian of our family anymore. I proudly told him I had paid his tuition in full for his upcoming attendance at MIT, officially securing his spot in their elite, highly competitive cybersecurity program. His brilliant, highly analytical mind had saved my massive corporate empire from absolute catastrophic ruin. Now it was time for him to hone those extraordinary technical abilities under the bright spotlight of that prestigious university, surrounded by passionate peers instead of vicious, manipulative predators. I gave him my absolute promise that whenever he was truly ready to assume control, the massive software firm and the entire ironclad financial trust would be waiting for him. He was the sole, undisputed heir to my entire legacy, but I made it abundantly clear that his only job right now was simply to be a normal young man. He deeply needed to learn, to make careless mistakes, to laugh out loud, and to finally experience the burden-free freedom and youthful innocence his mother had so cruelly stolen from him. He finally offered me a smile in return, a deeply genuine expression of profound relief. The gears of the federal judiciary turned remarkably slow, but they moved with an absolute, terrifying finality. Months after our quiet morning on the tranquil lake, Jonathan called to inform me of the ultimate, irreversible outcomes of the criminal proceedings. Valerie, completely stripped of her manipulative charm, finally ran out of pathetic legal maneuvers when faced with a mountain of undeniable audio evidence. The federal judge, completely unmoved by her hysterical courtroom antics, sentenced my ex-wife to 15 mandatory years in a maximum security federal prison, with zero possibility of early parole. Derek Lawson, whose massive corporate embezzlement scheme actively catalyzed the entire nightmare, received a devastating 12-year federal sentence, permanently ending his lucrative career and effectively ruining his arrogant life. The corrupt neurologist, Dr. Eris Thorne, was currently sitting behind thick security glass in a cold county jail cell, awaiting his own lengthy criminal trial. The justice system had finally worked. The vicious criminals were severely punished. The massive stolen corporate wealth was fully recovered. The innocent victims were firmly protected. Yet, sitting peacefully on the stone porch of my heavily secured estate and looking out over the beautiful, quiet grounds, I understood an absolute, undeniable truth. The system didn't actually save us through some miraculous, incredibly lucky accident. The system worked perfectly, only because we meticulously engineered our own flawless survival. We firmly refused to be helpless victims. We masterfully weaponized their blind arrogance against them. We struck back actively with cold, ruthless, calculated precision. The dark, terrifying war was officially over, and we had completely, undeniably won the hard-fought victory, protecting our peaceful future against all toxic threats and ensuring my beloved family legacy would endure perfectly forever. The rebuilding process didn't happen overnight. It required the same relentless focus and unwavering dedication I used when I built my software empire from scratch decades ago. 2 full years have passed since the heavy doors of the federal courthouse slammed shut behind Valerie and Derek, sealing their fates. You know how she is, Dad. During that time, I completely restructured my company from the inside out, implementing strict security and financial oversight layers to guarantee that internal fraud on such a scale could never happen again. When my 71st birthday finally arrived, I felt immensely confident that the primary phase of my reconstruction was complete. It was a crisp, sunny Tuesday morning, and I stood in a room packed with financial journalists, corporate stakeholders, and industry analysts at our headquarters in downtown Seattle. As I picked up the microphone, the bright flash of camera lenses illuminated the wooden podium. Looking down at the sea of waiting journalists, I calmly announced that I was officially stepping down as CEO. I wasn't retreating into the obscure shadows, nor was I succumbing to the slow, inevitable march of time to hand over my life's work. Instead, I was deliberately elevating myself to the respected position of chairman of the board. I retained absolute oversight, holding the ultimate veto power over the company's strategic direction, while permanently relinquishing the exhausting, deeply draining daily operational tasks. To fill my former role, I introduced a thoroughly vetted, exceptionally brilliant outsider named Marcus Sterling. I spent 6 months personally interviewing him, conducting background checks deeper than the federal government's and strictly evaluating his core ethical framework. Marcus possessed the exact combination of cold corporate efficiency and unwavering integrity that my company desperately needed to safely navigate the coming decades. Handing operational control over to him felt incredibly liberating. It was the deliberate, conscious choice of a mature man who finally understood that his legacy was secure enough to stand tall, even without his continuous physical presence. That historic transition granted me something I hadn't truly experienced since my 20s: genuine, unadulterated clarity. Valerie and her corrupt neurologists spent months trying to convince the world, and slowly convince me, that my old age was an insurmountable weakness, a terrible terminal illness rendering me completely useless. But stepping away from the micro-DLs of corporate management made me fully realize that my age was actually my greatest, most impenetrable armor. my mind had never been sharper. The toxic chemical fog from the daily doses of lorazepam had been thoroughly flushed from my system, leaving behind a crystal-like sharpness that nothing could dull. In the quiet space of my new life, I quickly found a rejuvenated sense of purpose. Instead of constantly battling aggressive board members over quarterly profit margins, I began spending my afternoons advising young, hungry tech startups. I openly offered my decades of hard-won business experience to brilliant, eager young minds working out of humble garages. I found immense joy in mentoring them, not just teaching them how to build profitable algorithms, but guiding them on how to navigate the dangerous, predatory waters of extreme wealth without losing their moral compass. I specifically taught them how to recognize the subtle warning signs of deep corporate deception and how to protect themselves from the catastrophic betrayals that nearly claimed my entire life. It was incredibly fulfilling, deeply meaningful work. I was actively shaping the next generation of ambitious, young innovators, finding a deep, lasting peace in freely sharing my knowledge rather than hoarding it behind closed corporate doors. That profound inner peace eventually extended into the physical walls of my personal life. During long, quiet afternoons, I often found myself walking slowly through the wide hallways of my Seattle estate. In the difficult first months after Valerie's highly publicized arrest, this massive house unfortunately felt like an echoing mausoleum, haunted by the dark memories of her terrible deception. Every expensive porcelain vase and rare piece of imported furniture reeked of her superficial ambition and calculated malice. So, I tore it all down. You know how she is, Dad. I hired a large team of aggressive contractors to completely gut the master suite main kitchen and formal dining room. We stripped away the cold, modern aesthetic she craved, replacing the sterile white marble with warm, inviting mahogany and deeply comfortable spaces. I intentionally converted her overly luxurious dressing room into a high-tech, state-of-the-art server room for Tyler, happily giving my brilliant son a dedicated, quiet space to further develop his coding skills. The dark, heavy energy that once hung over the estate like a suffocating shroud was completely banished. Today, as I walked slowly down the central staircase, I paused to look through the large windows at the calm waters of Puget Sound. A wave of genuine emotion washed over me as I realized this mansion no longer felt like the hostile, dangerous staging ground where I was almost quietly murdered in my sleep. It finally felt like a real home, a solid, impenetrable fortress of absolute peace. The freshly painted walls held no dark, terrible secrets. The shadows contained no lurking threats. The silence was no longer a terrifying signal of invisible plots, but a genuinely comforting tranquility. I fought a long, brutal war to reclaim my territory, and I emerged miraculously victorious. As the late afternoon sun began sinking toward the horizon, casting a warm golden light across the manicured lawn, I turned from the window and walked slowly down the long hallway toward my private study. I stepped inside, the heavy door shutting behind me with a solid click. The study was exactly as I originally designed it decades ago, lined with classic literature, aged leather, and illuminated by the soft light of a single desk lamp. I walked over to the grand mahogany desk and sat in the executive chair. Folding my hands on the spotless surface, I looked straight ahead. The terrifying journey of the past 3 years played through my mind like a vivid movie. The horrific personal betrayal, the painful deception, the chemical war waged against my mind, and the relentless destruction of those who arrogantly tried to bury me. I survived the darkest, most dangerous valley a man could be forced to walk. I faced the absolute most sinister side of human greed, emerging with my sharp mind, my wealth, and my precious son completely intact. Taking a deep, steady breath, I let the absolute stillness of the quiet room wash over my shoulders. I looked straight ahead, fully prepared to share the ultimate truth I learned after surviving the ultimate betrayal. They thought old age equaled weakness. Looking at my 71 years, they saw an easy target, a fragile, fading old man ready to be chemically erased and drained financially. Valerie and Derek stared at my wealth and quiet demeanor, genuinely believing that crushing a few sedatives into my warm evening tea would effortlessly send me into a quiet, forgotten void. They calculated their odds on the arrogant assumption that my decades of success had somehow made me weak, blind, and hopelessly dependent. But they forgot one crucial detail about my past. You don't survive for 40 years in the cold, ruthless business world on luck or submission. To build a massive software empire from absolute nothing, to construct a global enterprise starting from a rusty desk in a damp basement, you have to learn exactly how to fight in the darkest shadows. You have to systematically outsmart and crush packs of wolves that are hungrier, smarter, and far deadlier than a greedy, superficial wife and a smug CFO. I spent my entire adult life dismantling hostile takeovers and destroying corporate predators that would have eaten Derek Lawson alive as a morning snack. Valerie's fatal mistake was completely misjudging my character. She mistook my quiet home life for foolish passivity. She genuinely thought that just because I voluntarily took off my armor when walking into my own home, I had somehow forgotten how to wage a ruthless war. She was dead wrong. I never lost my sharp edge. I simply chose to keep it sheathed. When they threatened my life, my dignity, and the hard-won legacy I built with my blood and sweat, I drew that weapon with cold, terrifying precision. I operated with such silent, calculated accuracy that they didn't see it coming until the cold blade of justice was pressed firmly against their throats. Perhaps even more importantly, they made a massive, unforgivable miscalculation regarding the collateral damage of their treacherous plot. They completely forgot about my son, the quiet, highly observant teenager they dismissed, and tried to psychologically dominate. They failed to realize that the exact same blood flows through his veins. Tyler didn't cower in the corner. He didn't break or submit under Valerie's overbearing, abusive war. He possessed a deep, unyielding courage, standing completely alone in the dangerous shadows. He meticulously gathered hard evidence, carefully watched the predators lurking in our home, and patiently waited the optimal moment to strike. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that true, lasting strength is forged in the fires of adversity. Together, my son and I didn't just survive their treacherous ambush. We utterly annihilated them. We reclaimed our home. We secured our massive company, permanently winning back our unburdened future while leaving those pathetic conspirators to rot in the cold reality of federal prison. Sitting here today, looking around the peaceful silence of my study, I feel a profound, undeniable sense of absolute completeness. The dark, suffocating storm has passed, the skies are clear, and the foundation of my family's legacy is unbreakable. I walked through the deepest abyss of deception and emerged with an unshakable strength. The empire I built is safe, but the bond I share with my son is the true victory. We faced the ultimate betrayal and achieved total victory, bound together forever by the silent war we won side by side. I am no longer just a survivor. I am the absolute master of my destiny, and nothing can break us. Never mistake an older man's quiet composure for weakness, and never underestimate the loyalty of a child who sees the truth. Betrayal often arrives with a smile and a warm cup of tea, hiding in the most intimate corners of our lives. The greatest defense against manipulation is unwavering vigilance, and the courage to act in silence. Trust is a wonderful thing, but blind trust is a death sentence. Always protect your legacy. Verify the intentions of those around you. And remember, true strength doesn't lie in dodging the storm, but in calmly becoming the storm itself. If this story resonated with you or taught you to stay vigilant, please hit the like button and subscribe. Now, leave a comment below to let me know where you're watching from and how you deal with toxic people in your life. Stay sharp, stay strong, and I'll see you next time.